Now look at this.
What's up, baby bio penguins? Today we do topic 8.7 on disruptions to ecosystems. So first, let's go back to genetics for a moment. A mutation is going to be any type of change that we might see in the DNA. Mutations can come from multiple different things, but the most prevalent place that we see mutations is due to copying errors during replication. So having different mutations can lead to having different traits. And so if there's been a change in the environment, then one trait might be more favorable or less favorable than another trait. This leads us to adaptation. Adaptations are just these different traits that allow for a population to be more favorable in an environment. So next thing we need to talk about are invasive species. So an invasive species is a species that is not native to a certain area. It somehow gets introduced or it's brought into the area, and it begins to exploit the resources. Due to the fact that the invasive species have no natural predators and they have unlimited resources, they end up growing exponentially. So the 2022 question number 5 FRQ, part A, asks you to describe a characteristic of a community that makes a species invasive in that community, but not invasive in a different community. And there's 3 different answers you could have put here. You could have talked about there was no or reduced numbers of predators. You could have talked about there was no or reduced numbers of competition with other species. Or you could talk about that there was no or reduced amounts of diseases that species could be susceptible to. So part C is telling us that the invasive species is going to eat the individual SC2. They then want us to modify this diagram and show where that invasive species is. So we know the invasive species is going to be equal on the diagram with TC2. But it's important for us to recognize that by the invasive species being equal on that web with TC2, that means it is competing for SC2. So if it's a better predator, then it's going to outcompete TC2, which could cause the loss of TC2 in that population. Miss Jones, you're so confusing. I know, but it's a lot easier to say TC2 than talk about actually the tertiary consumer 2. The local ecosystem has to do with all the living things that are in a certain area as well as how they affect one another. Versus a global ecosystem has to do with the complex pattern of millions of species of organisms driven by the interactions of all these different physical factors, nutrients, chemical factors, competition, predation, human disturbance, and other biotic interactions. So anything that affects the ecosystem can cause destabilization of it. So if there's an introduced disease, if there's an introduced invasive species, if there's human activity that interacts and causes destruction of different parts or removes certain organisms, all this can cause destabilization. Last but not least, let's talk about biogeography. Biogeography is where we're going to study life forms and where they are located, in the past as well as in the present. And of course, as we saw in that last image, Pangea breaking apart led to a lot of changes. So as Pangea broke apart, we had more shallow water habitats as there was an increase in shoreline. In addition, more habitats were formed as we were now able to have the warm and the cold ocean waters kind of mixing up. And then as Pangea broke apart, we're seeing all these plant and animal life forms are now on isolated continents that leads them to these different unique adaptations. And of course, biodiversity will increase. If your bio penguins are just success, bye y'all.